Today we're going to look at congruent polygons and circles. So we're going to define what it means for a polygon or a circle to be congruent. And then we're going to look at the notation and the criteria for congruent polygons. So let's review first what congruent means. Congruent is a little different than equal, right? So congruent is when they have the same measure, okay? So it has this little symbol here. It almost looks like an equal sign, but then it has a tilde above the equal sign. And it's used for congruent figures. And it's also used for segments and angles. So you can say that two angles are congruent. You can say that two segments are congruent. And you can also say that two figures are congruent. And you're going to use this symbol. So remember, just because two segments have the same measure, it doesn't mean that those segments are equal segments. It means that they are congruent segments. Okay, so make sure you understand the difference between congruent and equal. So congruent is when we're talking about having the same measurement. All right, so let's look at our first definition, which is congruent circles, which are circles that have congruent radii. So if the radius of one circle, the measure of that radius, is equal to the measure of another radius, then you can say that those two radii are congruent. And because those two radii are congruent, those two circles will be congruent. Our next definition is a congruent polygon. Now there are three criteria that are needed for congruent polygons. It's almost like a little checklist. They have to have all three of these in order for them to be congruent. They have to have the same number of sides. The corresponding sides have to be congruent. And the congruent angles have to be congruent. So those are the three criteria: number of sides, those sides being congruent, and then corresponding angles are congruent. So let's take a look at this question. It says, are triangle ABC and triangle DEF congruent? So if we have angle A and angle D are congruent, and angle F and angle C congruent, then we can look angle ABC, which goes here, ABC, and triangle DEF, which goes DEF. So notice that the angles that are congruent line up with our question. So because of that, we would say, oh, and it's even going to go further. It has those two angles and those sides. So yes, triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. And this is how we would write it in correct notation. And so notice how the A and B is congruent to D and E, and A, B, and D, E are the corresponding letters on our question. So you have to make sure everything matches. Okay. So here is a multiple choice question. It says, given that these two triangles are congruent, the question is, segment AB is congruent to what? Segment AB is congruent to what other segment? So segment AB is here. And so notice we're looking for a segment on the other triangle. And we're looking at the notation with two hash marks. So the segment with two hash marks on it is XY. Okay, so AB is congruent to XY, which is number 2. Next question. So we have triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ, and it says angle B is congruent to what angle? So angle B, so there's a couple ways you can look at it. You can actually look at the triangles and notice which ones are marked the same, or you can actually look at our congruent statement. It says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. So remember, the letters are corresponding. So angle A is congruent to angle X. Angle B is congruent to angle Y, which means that the answer to this multiple choice, angle B, is congruent to angle Y. Next question. So what about triangle CBA? So this time we're rearranging the letters, right? But if we rearrange the letters here, we have to rearrange the letters in the other triangle. So this time we're starting with C, and since C was congruent to Z, that means our next arrangement has to start with the Z. B came next, and B was congruent to Y, so in our next arrangement has to be Y. A comes last in this arrangement, and A is supposed to be congruent with X, so X needs to appear last in our second arrangement. So that would be option number 3. Okay, so here's one where it says triangle ACB. So we went ACB, so we should go XZY. So that would be option number 4. All right, next definition is congruent triangles. Congruent triangles are triangles where the corresponding angles and corresponding sides are congruent. There is a theorem that says that triangle congruence is an equivalence relation. And you're like, oh, I remember talking about equivalence relation, but what exactly did that mean? Well, an equivalence relation is a relation that is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. Our next theorem says that circle congruence is an equivalent relation, and then polygon congruence is an equivalence relation. All right, that's all for now. Go ahead and read over this section in your book, taking some additional notes as needed if it wasn't included in the video, and then try some problems on your own.